Growing up, my best friend was my older brother, Anthony. In most cases, sibling rivalries start young and grow more frequent with each passing year, always competing for who gets more of their parents' attention, fighting over clothes, toys, etc. My friends at school would always complain about their siblings, but I could never relate to that sentiment. Anthony and I would have the occasional spat, but more of the time we got along perfectly fine. And as time went on, our bond only got stronger, but we probably have our closeness in age to thank for that. Anthony and I did everything together. We shared clothes and toys, we had all the same friends, and even at one point we shared a toothbrush, until our parents informed us how that was unsanitary. But you get my point, we were the best of friends. And I think our closeness was the reason he went missing. Over the summer, Anthony and I would be out of the house from the crack of dawn right up until the sun was gracing the western horizon with its presence. We would spend days on end down at the lake swimming, or go exploring the rock quarry pretending that we were treasure hunters. But our favorite pastime was exploring the woods behind our house. The woods were vast, stretching for miles in either direction. Our goal for the summer between our 5th and 6th grade year was to explore and map out the entirety of the woods. It was an ambitious goal, and I think even if we were given the entire school year to do so, we would fall flat. We did have some help, though. Our friend Tommy lived directly across the woods from our house. Our backyards weren't fenced in, and since they faced each other, it was very common for Tommy to show up on our porch asking to play, and vice versa. On the days that Tommy wasn't visiting his grandma or being forced to do yard work around the house by his hard-ass stepfather, he was in the woods with us, exploring. One day, around 7 o'clock in the evening, Tommy came knocking on our back door. It was a family dinner night, and we were watching Jeopardy with our parents. Before anyone had a chance to get up, Tommy had invited himself in. He was breathing heavily, as if he had just run a cross-country race, and his long brown hair was matted to his forehead with sweat. "Guys," he shouted, "you've got to come see this." Anthony's interest immediately piqued, and so was mine. "What is it?" I asked. "It's a surprise. I found something cool in the woods." We turned at our parents, silently asking them permission to go. We had just come back in for the day, so I was sure that they were going to say no. But then my mother agreed. "Okay," she said, "just don't be gone too long, and have fun." Having fun was always her one rule. With that, we set off. We rushed to deposit our dishes in the sink, barely taking the time to properly scrub them off before bolting out the door. Tommy was walking now, still trying to catch his breath. "Come on, Tommy, tell us what it is," Anthony pleaded. "Nah, like I said, it's a surprise." He twinkled his fingers at us, and we all giggled. It wasn't until we got deep into the woods that I became aware of how truly dark it was out now. The trees above served as a protection from the hot sun when we were out here during the day. But at night, it felt more like it was keeping us in, rather than keeping the sun out. We continued on. Eventually, Tommy's breath steadied, and we walked in silence for a few minutes. After a few minutes of us walking side by side, Anthony sped up a little, then turned to face Tommy and I. "Hey, guess what?" he asked. "What?" Tommy and I both answered in unison. Then, Anthony turned around and took off running. We would frequently race each other through the woods, and it would almost always start out this way. I should have seen it coming, but I didn't. "No fair," Tommy called. "Unfair head start." I followed up. Even without the head start, Anthony frequently beat me in these races. Despite being essentially the same age, we were Irish twins, so close that we're in the same grade in school. Anthony was taller, lankier. He had a good few inches on me, so his strides were always longer, and he could gain the upper hand almost flawlessly. We always told him he should try out for track and field, but sports weren't his thing. After a minute or two of running, Tommy and Anthony had left me in the dust. I could hear the rhythmic stomping of their feet up ahead, but I could no longer see them through the cluster of trees. I was all alone. I slowed down to a jog, admitting to myself that I didn't stand a chance of catching up now. Then, assuming they would wait for me up ahead, whenever they reached where we were trying to go, I slowed my jog down to a walk. The woods were silent now. I could no longer hear Anthony and Tommy running. I called their name, but didn't get a response. Breaking the silence of the woods felt wrong, and immediately a feeling of guilt washed over me for even daring to disturb its peace. Instinctively, I turned over my shoulder to look behind me, and I swore I saw something looking back. I looked back again, and whatever I saw had seemingly vanished. Panic was rising in my throat now, and my pace quickened. "Tommy! Anthony!" I whispered their names as loud as I could muster without disturbing the silence, or possibly alerting something to my presence. Behind me, I heard the snapping of a twig. Without turning around, I sped up in the direction of Tommy's house. Behind me, the sounds of footsteps and twigs snapping and breaking grew increasingly faster and closer. It seemed that every step I took forward, the sound got 2 steps closer. Eventually, I could feel whatever was chasing me breath down my neck. "Anthony!" I shrieked, now sure that whatever was coming for me was coming for blood. I felt pressure on my back, and I instinctively raised my arms to shield my face as I tumbled to the ground. Whatever it was, it had tackled me and was now on top of me. "Get off!" I shouted. I tried to wriggle out from beneath its grasp, but I was stuck. Then I heard laughing. I opened my eyes to see Tommy on top of me, staring down and laughing. He fell over onto his back, laughing so hard that his eyes were wet. I struggled to my feet. "What the heck?" I fought to keep my voice from wavering, from sounding scared, but it didn't work. I looked around, and Anthony came out from behind a tree. "Eric, I had no idea he was going to do that. I'm sorry." He looked over to Tommy, who was now starting to stand up. "You just said you were going to scare him, not do all that." Tommy wiped some tears from his eyes. "Okay, but you should have seen your face." He started to chuckle again. I turned my focus away from them. I could still feel tears welling up in my eyes, and I didn't want them to think of me as some big crybaby. "Dude, apologize." Anthony was chastising Tommy now. "It's fine," I said. "I'm going home." I started to head back the way we came, but Tommy stopped me. "Wait," he said. "I'm sorry for scaring the absolute pants off of you, but I did actually have something I wanted to show you guys." He gave me a look as if to say, "Please stay," and I relented. "Okay, what is it?" "Follow me." Then Tommy turned around and headed down a steep embankment. "I really didn't know he was going to do all that," Anthony said. "It's fine, he didn't even get me that bad." We both knew I was lying, but Anthony was kind enough to believe me. "You sure you're okay, though?" He gestured to my elbow. "You're bleeding." I looked down and noticed my left elbow was scraped, blood pooling up and dropping onto my shoes. In all the adrenaline, I must not have felt it. "It's fine. Mom's gonna be mad, though." We followed Tommy down the embankment. "Behold!" Tommy shouted when we got to the bottom. He stuck his arms out in a Tada gesture. Anthony and I were both confused. "It's a bush," I said. "No, it's what's behind the bush." Tommy parted some branches and stepped through, casually disappearing from sight. Without a second thought, Anthony and I passed through together. As soon as we came out the other side, the smell got 10 times worse. There was a buzzing of flies, constantly droning in my ears and burrowing its way into my brain. Out of instinct, I placed my arm over my mouth and nose to try and block out the smell. "God, it reeks," Anthony said. That was when I saw it. About 15 yards away lay a dead deer. But the deer wasn't just dead, it was eviscerated. The deer had been torn in half, the back half laying some 20 feet behind the front. Its guts spilled out, creating finger-like tendrils of blood that covered most of the surrounding area where the body rested. To me, it looked as if the front half was reaching for the back, trying to reconnect the 2 pieces and make itself whole again. "Oh my God!" Anthony shouted as he stepped forward, his shirt pulled up to cover his mouth and nose. "Isn't it cool?" Tommy said. To me, it wasn't. I was an animal lover at heart, and I cried when my parents even killed a spider. This sight thoroughly disturbed me, and I thought that if there was something in these woods strong enough to do this to a deer, what would it do to us? "Guys, maybe we should head back home," I said. "What's wrong, Eric? Are you scared?" Tommy mocked. "Stop it, Tommy." Anthony approached the deer slowly. Its black eyes were a bottomless void. Any and all life had drained out of it when it was ripped in half. Tommy approached it now as well, poking it with a long stick. Anthony did the same, pressing up its lips and shoving its tongue towards the back of its throat. A giant rush of wind blew through at once, blowing the stench directly into my face. "What do you think killed it?" Anthony asked. "I dunno, probably a bear," Tommy answered. "No," I said. "Mom says there are no bears in these woods." But now, looking at this poor animal, I wasn't so sure I believed her. We stayed a few minutes longer. Tommy and Anthony discussed all the horrible fates that they thought might have befallen the creature, while I sat idly by, drawing stick figures in the dirt. Eventually, I had convinced them that it was getting too close to dark, and that our mom would be mad if we didn't start heading back soon. We all set out, opting to walk Tommy to his house first, since he lived just a few minutes from where he found the deer. As we climbed the slope back to the top, I looked over my shoulder just one last time. I don't know if it was too dark or if my eyes were playing tricks on me, but the deer was gone. Before I had time to process, Anthony and Tommy were already yards ahead of me and not giving any sign of slowing down. I turned back around and jogged to catch up. "If you guys want, my mom could probably give you a ride home," Tommy offered. "No, it's fine," Anthony said, "unless Eric wants one." I stated that I was fine to walk, and that was that. We walked Tommy to the edge of his backyard, promising that we would be out bright and early tomorrow to come over and play, and then we set off. Tommy watched us depart, and right before he faded from view, he turned and ran inside. It would be years before I spoke to Tommy again. On the walk home, it was almost pitch black, and we were walking by what little moonlight was able to shine through the canopy above. "It's cold," Anthony said. I agreed. Then he followed it up with, "You know what will warm us up?" I shook my head no, and that's when he took off running. "No fair! You got a head start," I shouted. I heard him burst out into laughter ahead of me, and that was all the motivation I needed. With pure determination, I sprinted harder than I ever had in my life. The trees flew by in blurs of dark green and black, and eventually I was able to overtake Anthony. As I passed him, I shouted at him that he was a slowpoke, even though I could tell he wasn't giving this race his all. Meanwhile, I was on the verge of passing out. All these years later, I think that he knew I was still freaked out by Tommy's prank and the deer, that he wanted to get us home faster without embarrassing me about the whole thing, and that's why he took off running. He knew that if he started running, that I would follow. I would always follow. I trailed farther and farther ahead of him until he was barely visible to me. When I turned around to look, I could barely make out his silhouette in the distance. Eventually, I saw his run slow down into a jog, then to a leisurely walk. But I wasn't going to let up. I knew if I slowed down long enough that he would take off again, overtaking me and winning the race. He's done it before, and he would do it again. I burst out of the forest and into the backyard like my ass was on fire, almost immediately collapsing to the ground, breathing in as if all the air in the world was running out. After a minute, I stood up, ready to rub my victory in his face. A minute passed, and Anthony still hadn't come out of the woods. Then another minute passed, and another. After 5 minutes, he still hadn't come out. I approached the tree line, peering in to see if I could spot him, casually strolling off in the distance. "Anthony," I called, but there was no response. And in that instant, I no longer felt like I was peering into the woods, but that the woods were peering into me. "Eric?" I whirled around, and our mother was leaning out the back door, drying her hands with a dish towel. "What's going on?" I told her everything. Anthony challenging me to a race home and how I had beaten him. I told her that after catching my breath, I stood up and saw that he still hadn't come out. I told my father the same story. It feels like I told that story 1,000 times since that night and all the nights since. To cops and more cops. To the search team that went in looking for Anthony, then to the news. I told the story about our whole adventure to my parents and then to Tommy's. The story was in the news and I told it to the reporters. I have told that story, word for word, 1,000 times since the night that my brother disappeared. But the one detail that never changed, the one that Tommy or I never told anyone about, was the deer.